programmes are currently running around 10 minutes later than advertised, so now on Carlton we cross to ITN for an extended edition of the ITV Nightly News.
Doomed Concorde catches fire, then crashes near Paris. More than 100 killed as it comes down near hotel. Inquiry tonight into Concorde's first terrible failure. And Clinton forced to admit failure in Middle East peace bid.
From ITN, the ITV Nightly News with Dermot Murnaghan.
Good evening. 113 people were killed today in the first ever crash by a Concorde. The supersonic airliner, operated by Air France, came down in a huge fireball near a hotel on the northern outskirts of Paris. It had just left Charles de Gaulle Airport bound for New York, but was streaming flames and smoke even as it took off. 3 children were among those on board. Other Concordes, French and British, were grounded tonight, at least temporarily, until the cause of the disaster is established. John Draper reports.
Tonight at the scene of the crash, the remains of some of the dead were recovered, ready to be removed to a French mortuary. Of the Prestige supersonic jet itself, little now exists. But this rubble, investigators hope, will offer up the reasons why 113 people perished within minutes this afternoon. So intense was the inferno caused by thousands of gallons of aviation fuel that it's likely to continue smouldering well into tomorrow. This photograph captured the moment catastrophe struck Air France Flight 4590. Seconds after takeoff, one of its 4 huge engines was ablaze. No one knows why. Less than a minute later, this was the scene. In the circumstances, there seems nothing the pilots could have done to save the plane. It crashed just a few miles beyond Charles de Gaulle Airport. Emergency services were at the scene within minutes, but there was nothing they could do for the 100 passengers and 9 crew. It had crashed into the grounds of a hotel, killing 4 more people. A number on the ground were injured, including a British woman who luckily was only slightly hurt. An American pilot based in Paris was watching. He saw the entire incident and later described exactly how it happened. The engine went on fire on Concorde, it went straight up into the air and crashed.
It was a sickening sight, and when it hit, just a huge fireball, like a mini atomic bomb, went up, and it's just really a sickening sight. And I knew it was in trouble. The left side of the engine bank, there's 4 engines on the Concorde, and the left side, number 1 and number 2 engines, one of those obviously had a catastrophic failure because it's trailing flames 200 to 300 feet behind the airplane, and it probably wiped out the other engine next to it. So the airplane was in trying to climb on only 2 out of 4 engines, and it just couldn't gain altitude. He kept trying to get the nose up to gain altitude, which eventually caused a stall. The nose pitched straight up in the air, and the airplane just started rolling over and backsliding down toward the ground.
Around 400 firefighters and rescue workers were at the scene at one point, though there was little for them to do other than to smother the flames, cordon off the area, and await accident investigators. The plane had been chartered by a German company. Most of the passengers were German, though there were 2 Danes, an Austrian and an American on board. They were due to have begun a cruise of the Caribbean tonight. This evening, the Queen sent a message of condolence to both France and Germany. At Gonesse, the locals could only watch in silence as the firefighters continued to work through the debris, looking for clues, for bodies and their possessions. Surrounding the crash site, paramedics covered those bodies retrieved from the wreckage. This is harrowing work facing the French authorities, and investigators will be dealing with the worst aviation disaster to have occurred on European soil since Lockerbie. John Draper, ITN.
Well, for the very latest, over now to ITN's Bill Neely at the scene of the crash. Bill, what developments there tonight?
Well, all evening ambulances have been arriving here, but of course there are no survivors. The brutal facts of this crash are that there was £19,000 of aviation fuel on board this plane, and the plane was on fire when it hit the ground. Really, the 109 people on board had no chance at all. All evening, for at least the last 6 hours, smoke, sometimes huge drifts of it, have been coming across the countryside here from the still smouldering plane. Occasionally a hearse comes in and they have been picking their way through the fields, picking up the corpses which until now have been covered with white sheets and taking them to the mortuary. But no survivors and of course 4 dead on the ground.
And is any more emerging about those caught up in it?
Well, perhaps among the luckiest people tonight, 3 coachloads from Britain, 3 coachloads full of members of the Suffolk County Youth Orchestra. They were on their way, some of them, to the very hotel that the plane hit. There were about 60 due to check in at that hotel. They were, the leader estimates, about 30 to 40 minutes away from the hotel. They consider themselves very lucky tonight. They are at a hotel not far from here. Very subdued bunch of 14 to 19-year-olds. Very lucky to be alive. Many other people caught up in this, but those the only British people that we know who are tonight lucky to be alive.
Indeed, Bill. Thanks a lot. Air France confirmed only yesterday that, like British Airways, it had detected microscopic cracks in the wings of its Concordes. It said they had no implications for passenger safety. So if it wasn't that, what could have caused this evening's disaster? Here's our science editor, Lawrence McGuinty.
When a Concorde dives into the ground with 26,000 gallons of fuel on board, the ensuing fire means investigators have very little to go on. But this picture of the Concorde on fire just after takeoff gives them some real clues. John Guntrip is a former crash investigator and was a test pilot for the prototype of Concorde's engines.
It's an extraordinary picture. There's obviously been a catastrophic engine failure, uncontained within the engine, which has led to huge quantities of fuel being released and burning behind the aeroplane.
One eyewitness said the plane was already on fire before it left the runway. So if the crash was caused by a catastrophic engine failure, what could have gone wrong? A single part of the engine could have failed. For instance, a turbine blade may have flown off. There could have been total engine failure. Or it could be something as simple as an obstruction, a bird getting caught in the engine.
You can think of all sorts of reasons for an accident soon after takeoff. It can include things which are really nothing to do with the aeroplane, like bird strikes. And birds do congregate round airports.
Earlier this week, British Airways grounded one of its 7 Concordes because of hairline cracks in internal struts in the wing. But experts say that's a coincidence and almost certainly had nothing to do with today's disaster.
It's highly unlikely that the cracks have been discovered had anything to do with this at all. It really would be astonishing. Granted, it's very early in the investigation, of course. It's difficult to imagine that plays a role. I can't really see a scenario that would make sense.
From its early days, Concorde boasted an immaculate safety record. Only when crash investigators find the black box and the cockpit voice recorder will they begin to understand what went wrong and led to the tragedy that marred that record. Lawrence McGuinty, ITN.
And Lawrence joins me now. Lawrence, can the discovery of those cracks in the wings be a coincidence?
I think it must be. The Civil Aviation Authority, the safety body here, knew about those and allowed BA to continue to fly its plane. So clearly they didn't think it threatened the safety of the plane. And that really dramatic picture we've seen of the flames trailing from the engines, it's very difficult to think of a theory that connects cracks in the wings with that kind of disaster. I think that theory is dead.
So we know the air investigators are on the scene tonight. What exactly will they be looking for?
Well, above all else, they'll be looking for the black box and for the cockpit voice recorder. They won't at this stage be ruling anything out, even a connection with the cracks. What they'll want to know, though, is what the pilot said and what the engine was doing at the time of the disaster. A fire in an engine shouldn't destroy a plane. Concorde could take off with a full passenger load and a full fuel load and only 2 engines. Something other than that went wrong. Probably that the control surfaces or the control wires in the plane were burnt through and the pilots couldn't control it. What the investigators will be looking for is evidence of that kind of catastrophic failure rather than just simply an engine fire.
But at the moment we can only guess. Lawrence, thanks a lot. Well, Concorde, the world's first supersonic passenger airliner, first flew more than 30 years ago, a technological triumph for Britain and France. Famously flying faster than a bullet, it's remained the aircraft of choice for the rich transatlantic traveller. Here's ITN's Terry Lloyd.
For 31 years, Concorde has symbolised style and safety. Until today, there has never been a single accident involving the supersonic airliner. It's a remarkable tribute to Anglo-French engineering and a concept developed back in the 1960s. Concorde's maiden flight was in 1969.
And now she's ready for takeoff. And there she goes.
Pilots were taught to fly at twice the speed of sound, able to cross the Atlantic in just 3.5 hours. It had, until today, an immaculate service history.
It's a very sad day today, and I know that all the British Airways Concorde crews, British Airways for that matter, will all be feeling great sorrow and sadness for Air France, for the Air France Concorde crews, and for the German passengers who lost their lives in the accident. It's a nightmare for anybody who loves Concorde.
Concorde became the pride of the fleet for British Airways and Air France, and the first choice for first-class travellers. Rock stars and celebrities queued for seats alongside business leaders and the very rich. Tonight, BA and Air France are awaiting news from crash investigators before deciding the immediate future for their Concorde fleets. Terry Lloyd, ITN.
And we'll be returning to the Concorde crash later, but first the rest of the day's main news. The Middle East peace talks at Camp David collapsed today. 2 weeks of non-stop talking failed to resolve the main stumbling block between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the future of Jerusalem. President Clinton said he believed the two sides would eventually reach a deal. From Washington, James Mates reports.
The presidential helicopter flew back from Camp David for a final time through sheer effort of will. President Clinton had kept these talks going when others wanted to walk away. Today, somewhat dejected, he finally admitted defeat. Some progress had been made, but under the rules of this summit, until everything was agreed, nothing was agreed.
I have concluded with regret that they will not be able to reach an agreement at this time. As I explained on the eve of the summit, success was far from guaranteed. However, while we did not get an agreement here, significant progress was made on the core issues.
He made it clear he believed Israel had gone further than the Palestinians towards finding a compromise, a view shared, not surprisingly, by the Israeli Prime Minister.
We were ready to end the